networking. I'm Elizabeth, most of you know me, we've met. I'm the director of the museum here at Oglethorpe, and very happy to have Nathan Lewis here, an artist who I've known for the better part of a decade. I've had a file in my mind on my computer and on my desk with his name on it for years now, thinking, how in heaven's name can I find a way to show his work? And it's finally worked out, and the timing is perfect, I think. So I want to mention before I introduce him that we have obviously a lot of different lectures happening for the museum. I'll be giving another lecture about this exhibit in November. The main exhibit that's up now, that's part of our Rubens series, is the French satire exhibit, The Sorrow of Too Many Joys. And you see that all the way down the hall in Center Gallery and in Rubens. So after this lecture, if you haven't already, please take a look at that exhibit. Many, many interesting lectures that are connected to that. So Nathan, and even though I've known you for the better part of a decade, I didn't realize exactly how you started. I love that you said you had a tenuous relationship with academia. He was born in Northern California and was much more interested in BMX biking, apparently, than painting and drawing and photography. And so I would say what that tells me is that he's someone who's unafraid of a challenge, is very daring, and he's probably broken some bones. I don't know how that relates to painting, but I see your adventurousness in your work. He is now residing in Connecticut and works at Sacred Heart. He spent some time in Russia and kicking around the Hermitage, and has, what I can say is, and I hope I'm speaking for you properly here, an incredibly eclectic sense of sources and inspirations. And I'm very, very happy that you've made it here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Nathan.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm very happy and honored to be here with you. And it's the first time I've been to Atlanta. I've heard about Southern hospitality, but I have to say people have been incredibly polite. I'm not used to that. I'm from the Northeast, and so I almost feel like I should be blushing every time someone says something nice. With the talk, I'm going to take you through a lot of work. I'll talk a little bit about my origins in getting into art, and I'll talk about some of the ideas behind the work. Please feel free, if you have a question as I'm going through, feel free to ask a question, and I try to include most of what's in the show. There are a couple I didn't include, so after the talk, if you want me to talk about those, I'm more than happy to, but I tried to keep it to an hour. We can get started. I chose this slide, and it's a detail from a painting that's a self-portrait done in about 2005. But it has a little piece of text in it. It says, "This is your land," if you can't read that. When I got into art, I think one of the reasons that made me stick with it, or made me realize that maybe it was for me, or maybe I was an artist, was that I never really felt I had any sort of say in the world. And I think in painting, within the confines of a little rectangle, I had a lot of say. And there was also a sort of interest of being okay with the unknown, not really understanding what I'm doing, and being okay with that and being patient. And I think those characteristics sort of help one in art field. I am a professor, so sometimes when I see that in students, I know those are the ones that have a chance to sort of go on. I see a lot of talented kids, but I think you have to sort of need something. If you go to the next slide, you can sort of see the picture that it's coming from. So this was a self-portrait, and there's a humorous aspect to it. There's you could think of the scale shifts, but one of the things that I was trying to achieve was I was working very graphically, and you can see those towers in there. There are a couple of paintings, this one to the right and the one with the Parisian in the back that have towers in them, and that was from a series of works I'll talk about. But this particular piece, I was trying to go back to a sense of naturalism with the portrait and seeing if I can include that and myself in this world that I was creating that was more graphic. Let's go to the next slide. This is me in 1990 riding a bicycle. I really wasn't an artist. I don't have an artistic background. Had an aunt that painted, but I really didn't spend a lot of time with art. I was into bicycles and youth culture, and I was doing things that were creative. I was making this little magazine. My mother is an insurance agent. She had a Xerox machine in her office, so after hours I'd go in there and let's start printing off the issues. And you know, I did a couple of these issues. But this is sort of where I started out, and there were a lot of creative people in the skating and BMX scene of California. So some of my influences, even though I get really heavily into art and museums and history, there's also this sort of other side that sort of gets mixed in. As Elizabeth said, some of my inspirations are eclectic. Next slide. I took a couple of art classes in community college. I took a lot of classes in community college. I was in and out of school a lot. I met this guy, Fred Dalkey, and that's an example of a drawing of his on the right. And I think if you look at the drawing, you can get a sense of his sort of indebtedness to history, I would say, to Rembrandt, but also to sort of 19th century academic drawing. He would draw in class, and he would draw along with us. We would be drawing from mostly portraits and figures, and he would draw right along with us. So I could see what he was doing, and I could see what I was trying to do. But he would also show us slides. So he would take us into a classroom, and he'd show us slides from museums, and he'd start naming people like Rembrandt or Filippo Lippi, a lot of people I hadn't heard of before. And I could see the connection between his work and the slides he was showing. I couldn't necessarily connect myself to that, but I could connect myself to him drawing and me drawing in the same class, and then connect him to the art history. And I think that simple sort of link of realizing that this guy is doing something that I'm doing, and I can see this connection to history, it sort of opened the doors for me, and I started getting much more interested in the art that was out there, the art that has been made over time. So I started looking at art museums and galleries, and I started thinking that, you know, this isn't just some old thing on a wall, it's actually a human made this, and what's going through their heads is not that different than what's going through ours. Next slide. So I really started to go to museums. I spent 6 months in St. Petersburg, living close to the Hermitage, and I spent 6 months in Italy, and I still spend a lot of time in museums trying to suck up whatever I can from them. These are some examples of copies that I did from sketchbooks. Or the picture on the right is actually this last summer. I'm teaching students to do the same thing in Rome. You can go to the next slide. These are some more examples. I had a very sort of traditional representational background. Florence Academy of Art, Lyme Academy College of Fine Art, lots of figure drawing. I really wanted to be able to represent what I saw. So there was a lot of training going that way. And I think my artwork sort of veers off from that, and then it sort of returns. So I think the next slide is of a piece that's in this show. This is a still life, Vanitas looking in, looking through. The history of still life in Europe, they call it natura morte, which is like dead nature. I think that's always a part of the history of still life. But every once in a while, I'll sort of return to setting something up and just painting it from life. Usually when I'm between series and I want to sort of go back and just spend time with nature, looking at life. So this is sort of representative of that. I do make my students paint a black and white painting, and I realize I never paint in black and white, so I thought, maybe I'll try it. Next slide. you can see the setup. It's in my studio. Sometimes it's nice to see images in a studio instead of separate. You can get a sense of how things were made. Next slide. This is probably, when I look back at this piece, this is a piece that sort of has some components that are still there in terms of what interests me in art. And it is a simple still life, but it has patterning, it has graphicness, it has this sort of philosophical questioning that I think is pretty consistent. There's also a little humor in there, probably dark humor. And there's text. At the bottom, you can see the text. I put it at the top. He desired precisely that which he felt he did not deserve. That's a line from a Umberto Eco novel, Foucault's Pendulum. And when I was doing this still life, I was sort of thinking about the fish there, and that it's in this world that it doesn't belong, and it's not in the water, but it wants the water. So I have him to the side of the plate, trying to get to the straw that has the water in the glass. And then I'm sort of referencing the water with the waves in the background, and the napkin with the sort of curves. But some of those characteristics, that sort of questioning, thinking about maybe not belonging, thinking about like existential questions, I think that's here. So when I look back at this, I can sort of relate it to some of the things that come after. Next. This is another piece somewhat early. A lot of my work is inspired by literature or things I've read, and it gets my mind to start thinking or imagining. The Painted Bird, you can go to the next slide, was a novel by Jerzy Kosinski, written in '65, and it's sort of an imaginative story of a young Jewish boy sort of going from town to town and meeting people, and he's describing the different scenarios that he has to go into. You can go next slide. And the title itself refers to a certain section in the book where the boy is working with a bird catcher, and the bird catcher is something's not going right for him. I think he wants a girl that doesn't want him, or he's frustrated, and he does this incantation, this ritual on a bird. He finds the biggest bird that he has, and he grabs bright colors and he paints it. It's a dark bird. And he paints it and he brings it out to the place where he caught it. And he starts squeezing the bird, and the bird starts squawking. And the other birds from the same flock, they hear the call. They know it's one of theirs, so they start swarming overhead. And he lets the bird go, and the bird sees its flock, and it's trying to go back into the flock. But when it does, they see the different colors, and they think that it's a different type of bird. So he keeps trying to get back into the group, and they keep pushing him out. They keep attacking him. So in the moment, in the narrative, I'm sort of, the attack isn't happening, but you can sort of see it happening, and it's right between those two things. The bird has been changed. It doesn't know it yet, but it's been changed by the colors that have been put on it. So when I read that little scenario, it was so haunting to me and so amazing at the same time that I knew I wanted to do a piece about it. So I started thinking about it, and you can go to the next slide. I was thinking inspirationally about Giotto, his frescoes in the Arena Chapel. I got to see those this summer. I always wanted to see them. But that big, vast blue background. And then if you look at the placement of the birds, or the number of birds, it's very similar to the angels sort of flying around the crucifixion. This was like a stylistic influence, but I think in terms of the weight and the gravity of the piece, I was thinking narratively how similar the story is. In the Christian story, it's a man that's made different, or if you choose to explain it that way, and he's cast out and destroyed by fellow men. The bird is made different by its colors, and it's not accepted in the group of the other birds. You can go to the next one. So also in the genesis of like making this piece, I was thinking, okay, what kind of bird is it going to be? And so Edward Muybridge, a photographer from the late 19th century. He did a series of books, Man in Motion, or Human Locomotion, and Animals in Motion. And you can see the separate photos. You can see this as the beginning of the film industry. You know, this is like the beginning of animation. This is where photography goes. His turkey vultures flying. If you look carefully, you can actually see that I'm using those directly in the piece. So when I used those, it also became about the story of painting and my own story in terms of what do I want from painting. You can go to the next one. That sort of war between photography and painting in the 19th century, painters were threatened by photography. You can see Delaroche, who's a sort of an academic painter. He sees the first photograph and he says, "From today, painting is dead." Of course, painting doesn't die, it changes, and artists start emphasizing different things. But that sort of tension was there. Next slide. So I think one of the things I was thinking about, why do I want to be a painter in today's world where you have ready-made images at your hands with phones and computers and cameras and everything else. So I was thinking about the difference between this painted bird and the other birds. How is it different? And I was thinking about those two parts. So when I did the painting, you can go back to the next image. I screen printed the other birds, and then I hand painted the center bird that's being released. So it became not just an illustration of the story, it also became like, I guess, a quandary about the state of painting today and about my own sort of doubts and, I guess, beliefs in painting. Next. I'm going to talk about a series of works, and you can see a couple of pieces that are in here. The Tower series, and there are actually more than these. There are a lot of pieces that I did with this, and it was sort of a motif that stayed with me for a good amount of time. And the way that it started was I was driving down the street, and I've always been a bit of a scavenger, a dumpster diver. I've never passed up a good garbage bin. Who knows what might be in there. And I was driving my car, and there was this plastic prop on the side of the street, and I couldn't figure out what it was, but it seems like everything good happens when you're driving, you know, and it's dangerous to stop. But so I saw it, and I immediately pulled over, and I went and picked it up, and I grabbed it, and I was trying to think, what is this thing? You can go to the next slide. There's a picture of the plastic prop, and to give a sense of scale, you can see me over there. So this sort of became this obsession of mine. And again, I'm always reading stuff, and I think I was reading Borges at the time. He has a story called The Zahir. Next slide. And the Zahir is an object or a being which has this terrible power to be unforgettable. It becomes an obsession. In the story, it's like a coin that he sees. But for me, it was this tower, and I was thinking, you know, what is this tower? You know, where did it come from? Was it part of a racetrack? Is it an oil derrick? Is it like a watchtower? What is it? And so I started thinking about all the possibilities of what it could be. And I had a whole series of work come out from playing with that idea. Next slide. One of the ways I use this, and I'm sort of using this to set up one of the pieces in the show, is that I used it as a symbol for like institution. So in this piece, Comedy of Errors, I'm sort of punning on Shakespeare, Comedy of Errors, but I'm thinking about over time how different institutions, different ways of thinking get established and they become the norm. But then new ways come, and some institutions fall, others are rising. So that's sort of what I was thinking about when I was constructing this. And if you look in the lower right-hand corner, you can see that image, which is also in the image in this show. So let's go to the next slide. The title of this is Are We Not Men? And you can see in the upper left, you can see the title sort of coming in from the side, but you also see the text at the bottom, Ecce Homo, which means behold man. But to talk about the title first and how these sort of influences come in, you can go to the next slide. Are We Not Men was the title of an album by Devo. Yeah, you can press the song Jacko Homo. It goes through those lyrics. It'll take a second. Devo was a band that they were unusual. Nothing was like them when they came out, and they were sort of outsiders. They were nerds and sort of intelligent geeks that were into music. But that sort of question of are we not men sort of came to me in this piece. I'm often listening to all sorts of music, classical, folk, punk, all sorts of stuff. Not too much country. But I must have been listening to it when I was thinking about this, and that sort of question, are we not men, came up with this piece. This is the title on the back. A lot of these pieces have titles on the back. But so that's where the title comes from, Are We Not Men? But I want to talk about some of the other influences. Go to the next slide. So we go back to the piece and you see Ecce Homo. You can also see, if you look, you can see the tower in the background and the fact that it's turning down. And when I showed you the piece before, it was sort of like an institution that was changing, and that's how I'm trying to use it here. So to the Ecce Homo part, next. That's what Pontius Pilate says after Christ has been whipped and mocked, and he presents him to the people, and he says, behold the man. You can see a Rembrandt etching of that right there. But what happens in the history of art is sometimes they don't show the narrative form of that. Sometimes they show more of an iconic form of that. And you can see it sort of going in that direction up on the right. You still see Pilate, but you see more of an emphasis on Christ and the wounds and the instruments of the Passion. And at the bottom, it sort of morphs into this Man of Sorrows format. Man of Sorrows comes from Isaiah. There's a text in the Old Testament, and Christians are always looking for, Jewish lines in the Old Testament to relate, to show the connection. But Ecce Homo, in its narrative form, is this, but in its iconic form, it's more of a Man of Sorrows, and that's how I was sort of using it. Next slide. And I was thinking about this character, this face, as a Man of Sorrows, and thinking historically about that face. If you're not familiar with the face, it's a historic film of a Parisian as the Germans are taking it over. It's, I think, like 1940, so it's World War II. The Germans are taking over Paris, and he's sort of weeping, seeing his city being taken over. Next slide. You can click on the left. This is the actual film. You can see the little segment. And then stills have been taken from, there he is right there. Yeah, so I think when he's crying, I think historically they're actually like taking French flags down, but you can see that they're cutting it and showing like the Germans marching in. So Paris, which is this sort of center of art and 19th century art, most specifically, you think about the might of the Germans or the German Reich coming in there, and you see this guy just sort of feeling the injustice of that. And I think that's what I'm really thinking about in this piece, is that, do we place culture over power? What does the world tell us? Is the world the story of power or the story of culture? I have my doubts that it's the story of culture. That's the story that I want it to be. But I think I'm thinking about when you value something like culture, you also understand the threat to it. Moving on to this. This is another piece with a tower in it. It's very hidden, very small. And this is the last piece that I did with the tower in it. It's called Till We Find the Blessed Isles Where Our Friends Are Dwelling. And the title comes from Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And Nietzsche was one of the first philosophers that I actually really started to enjoy. I think it appeals to young people, but I think specifically because I was an artist too. He has an incredibly rational mind, but underneath that he has this sort of, I don't know, bohemian spirit. Nietzsche does. You can go to the next slide. This translation of Nietzsche I sort of carried around with me, and I would be reading it all the time. But his term, the Blessed Isles, is actually a Greek term. The Blessed Isles, or the Elysian Fields, are where the virtuous go to die. So it's their concept of heaven. And that's sort of how I'm using it in this piece, that they're going off to this promised land. And the phrase itself, myself as an artist, trying to make my way into the world, I'm sort of nomadic. I'm going around different places. I'm squatting in buildings, meeting people along the way that think similarly. If you don't have I didn't really have a community. I didn't have an artist community growing up, but you find important people for your path. And that phrase meant something to me. I wrote it down, and I thought, that's sort of what I'm doing. I'm trying to make a future from all these fragments, these things that I'm seeing, and I'm thinking about one day, I'm going to reach this golden spot. So that line, I knew I was going to do something with it. I just didn't know when, and it was probably 10, 15 years before I ended up doing a piece that talked about it. So we can go to the next slide. In the actual construction of the painting, you can see I had all sorts of people pose, and I taught at a lot of different schools, so I would have students pose, and these were some of the photo shoots. Just to give you a sense of the process, you can see me, someone's holding her ponytails over there. You can see the grouping, I think over here. You can see this grouping here, but then this figure, I moved to the front, and then her hand is wrong, so I have to paint a new hand. I have this sort of an idea of the composition I want, but then you try different things out, and you have all these different sources, and then you're trying to put them together. I think in terms of them going towards this promised land too, the students are someone I really felt for in that they're educating themselves. They're looking for this future, they're doing things to sort of look for this promised land. But there's another part of the narrative also that I was trying to get across, and this is the part that relates to Washington crossing the Delaware. Next slide. So you can clearly see the reference. Most people, when they see this painting, they automatically think Washington crossing the Delaware, or sometimes they think like the raft of the Medusa, and it's very indebted to sort of to history painting, French 19th century history painting. Lutz is a German, but it's in that grand sort of epic painting category, so I'm sort of playing on that. The Lutz painting is in the Met, and I can see that, and so I think in the time I was thinking about painting, this is like 06, 07, I'm looking at that painting and I'm thinking like, well, who are we as a nation? Where are we right now? And can we relate to this painting? This painting and the sort of story that's being told is we're fighting for our independence. So there's this, wading across water through the ice to fight for freedom and independence. So I'm sort of playing on that. You can see I'm using some of the same figures. Some of the figures are clearly based. This figure here, this figure. The figure at the back is sort of like this one. So that's the starting point, but I'm thinking, what does our nation look like now? It's not, we have much more in terms of, we have more ethnicity, we have females in the roles of leadership, so I have an Asian female in the role of Washington at the front of the boat. But it's tough to talk about. It's a complex narrative. So one narrative is the going for the promised land. This is the students. These are the Americans I believe in. The other part is a sort of critique of how we're viewed as a nation. This is when we're going into Iraq. This has to do with our involvement with the Middle East, and it has to do with our dependence on foreign resources, oil specifically. And I had been playing with that with the tower in different pieces. So in this piece, you see them crossing this body of water, but you have these clues like the dragging gas can here, and you see the oil derrick in her hand. I have some details in the next one. These sort of clues that tie you into that there's a critique happening. I was thinking about the patriotism too that was sort of rampant at the time. So instead of flying one flag, let's fly two flags. And playing up the heroicness of them crossing the body of water. It's not enough that they have to like break ice. It needs to be uphill, this impossible journey that they can never make. So there's a little bit of parody here, but it's mixed in with this sort of truth in terms of seeking that promised land at the same time. Next slide.
Could I ask?
Yes.
I grew up in the West, and so your background there is very reminiscent of a Western landscape.
Yeah. I've lost track of what mount it is. It's sort of, I'm not exactly sure. It's from like a nature book. I confess I've cut up many books for images and things like that. Sometimes I don't know what they are. It's actually, there's a funny story. I had a World War II book, and I had the famous photograph of Mussolini and his mistress after they're caught and they're hung. And I used that in a piece, and I sort of visualized them as the two characters in Waiting for Godot. So in the painting, that's who it is. And then in the process of painting it, I realized that that's who it is. So painting for me has been a way to history, has been a way to literature, to the world at large. And a lot of the times when I'm making a piece, I'm pulling these things and using them for my purpose, and then I later learn what they are. I still have yet to learn what mountain range that is. The water is from the Colorado River. The trees are from Connecticut, and the characters are from Connecticut. Yeah.
Symbolism of the child and what's happening, and to say that, I guess.
Yeah, so with the students, if you look at this figure, this is also the same figure that is holding the derrick in the front. And so I was thinking a little bit about them being students, and as students, we see them come in as children, and slowly through education, they sort of take the reins. They start to think independently, they start to form their ideas, they start to act on them. So the inclusion of her twice where she's about to drop the doll, which is signifying leaving childhood, and then, a position of leadership. Yeah. Next slide. The foreground figure here, when I was painting it, I had the boat in there, and then I knew I needed something up top. The tree came, so I went driving around looking for a tree and trying to photograph it. And then I went out into the mountains to look for branches, and I had the rock and the tree there, but I felt I needed a figure there. So I scoured and looked, and I looked through images that I had, and I had an image of my father, and I ended up putting him there. But that sort of contrast of him being older and most of the people in the boat being younger, I thought that was an interesting sort of play, and it was many versus one. And so it brought up the story of Moses leading the Israelites to the Promised Land, but not being able to go there himself. Next slide. Let's see, you know, he's able to look on it. I think he's cursed because instead of talking to a rock, he strikes it. The Old Testament God was pretty mean with those curses. But I think putting that figure in there, it made me sort of think of that. And that's part of the process too. I love doing these paintings. It takes so much time because I can think about what's going on, and I can process. So I'm usually painting things that are, there's a sense of turmoil or discord. And then through the process trying to figure out what I think about them. Next slide. This goes to the Blessed Isles. So this is a narrative form of going towards that sort of promised land. This is more of an icon form, just like when I showed you with the Ecce Homo thing. In working with narration, there is like the cinematic where the story is happening, it's action, and you can sort of look at that as a slice of time, like a moment in time. But there's also narratives that happen through the context of objects next to more like a semiotic approach of what something represents. And the format of this piece was heavily influenced by pieces I had seen, particularly in the Met. There's a piece by Giovanni Di Paolo, I think it's on the next slide. Yeah, on the left. I've always loved this painting. It's in the Lyme collection, very small, about this big. But this sort of line between representation and like diagrams. On the right, you see like an alchemical manuscript. On the left, on the lower right, you see an astrological calendar. And if you look at the Giovanni Di Paolo, that's what you're seeing around the side. But I think this is Eden. That's sort of related to what I was trying to do with the round, the tondo painting. You can go back to it. So in the center you have the sort of symbol for the Blessed Isles that we're trying to get to. Yeah, you can go forward. One more. Yeah. So to talk about a little bit, in the same way that with the narrative, I'm interested in narratives that aren't easy to tell. I don't think in life it's easy to have simple opinions like this is right, this is wrong. I think there are a lot of gray areas, and I think sometimes you can be both things. And I don't always think that it's easy to figure things out. And in images, one of the reasons I'm fascinated with them is that they can imply multiple things. And that ram that's at the bottom of the painting, that's a figure that I've used multiple times. It's in here twice, in this drawing and in that painting. And one of the reasons that it fascinates me so much is that it looks like a goat, but it's a ram. So it's a sheep that looks like a goat. But the implications of a goat and a sheep are totally different in how they've been used in art. And that sort of fascinates me. It makes you sort of second guess your initial impulses. So in the context of working within like an astrological chart, the ram or the goat seems to signify Capricorn. And Capricorn is, you can see the dates for Capricorn. So it's part of it is January. And January comes from Janus, the god, the two-headed god. So that same idea of two things in one, looking forward, looking back, beginnings and ends. So January is the end of one year and the beginning of the next. But the ram does that for me. Next slide. There's an actual picture of the ram. This was a piece of taxidermy my father owned. I ended up drawing and painting it so much that he gave it to me, so now it's in my studio. But again, that idea of things being able to be read in multiple ways. So you see in the history of art, you see like a scapegoat, and then you see like a sacrificial lamb on the bottom. This was a journal entry, and I think it's tied, it's philosophically tied to some of the things that I'm drawn to in art, which is sometimes you have experiences and they affect you, and you can't quite make sense of them, and you try to interpret, and you can interpret two very contrasting interpretations. So in the scenario I said in my journal, someone smiles at you. Someone can be smiling at you because they're mocking you. They could be smiling at you because they wish you happiness, and that it's in that sort of line between the two that I have a lot of interest. Next. You also see rings of text, and the one on the left is from Kafka, and it's about parables. I think what I'm looking at there is I'm looking at this quest for this promised land and doubts about it. And I think Kafka, in his parables, he's very good at sort of showing those uncertainties. The Inner Ring is a poem by Stephen Crane, and just to paraphrase, a guy looks up and he sees a ball of gold in the sky. He goes up to see it and he sees that it's clay. And then he comes back down to earth and he's bummed. He's like, I thought it was gold, it's clay. He comes back down, he looks back up, and he sees it again, and he says, oh my God, it's gold, it's gold. So you can interpret it in different ways. You could interpret it that guy's an absolute fool, like he's already forgotten, or maybe he's like basing too much on his senses. Or it's possibly that there needs to be distance between seeing something, that it's not physical. You don't have to physically get something to achieve it. Some things are metaphysical or philosophical. But again, that sort of dilemma between, like, how do you read that poem? You could interpret it either way. And that, to me, is part of, I guess, the beauty of art, or like trying to solve existential problems through art. The dilemmas are there, as well as like the avenues to that path. Next slide. So in this, you see the Blessed Isles in the center. That's that Stephen Crane poem. These are the Kafka parables on the outside. So I'm thinking of like different avenues to it. You see the animal kingdom, things from nature, minerals, humans, technology, playing up the astrological a little bit too, like Gemini, the twins. You see like these mirrored Fred Astaire's. And if you look at the girl with the laptop, her screensaver shows them. So this sort of roundabout avenue towards getting where you want to get. Next. Yeah.
I was just wondering, that branch there, is this supposed to be like a hand, like a word of God or something like that?
Certainly, I could see that allusion. I've used hands a lot. I've used that reference. I think I was trying to think of showing that reaching this sort of paradise was not impossible, but it wasn't guaranteed how you would get there. So I had a couple of areas actually reach into the inner circle. Yeah.
I think because you do have so many very specific images, the temptation is to ascribe a meaning to everything. And one thing I like about your work, but it's also confusing, is that I don't understand your lexicon, and you're drawing from so many different things, which makes it both fabulous and confusing. Do you intend for the visitor to be left with that kind of discord? I mean, that, for me, was why I wanted you to exhibit this during the satire show, because I think there's something kind of subversive. You, on one hand, you're showing everything. You're giving these very blatant references, and then there are other things that just don't seem to fit with this alphabet. Is that your intention?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm trying to confuse someone. I may be trying to complicate the reading. Sometimes I'm trying to complicate the reading. And depending on the piece, some pieces are more direct. And I would say some of the narrative ones, most of the ones in the show, I would say are less direct. I have some pieces that I think are very easy to interpret. And then there are other ones that are either more complicated, like the ideas that I'm trying to get across. Like, I think this is a complicated idea, but I think the presentation is maybe a little more direct. When it's more the sort of symbol-based, the illusions are just all over the place. And I don't always know exactly what they're about, and that's part of the process for me, and they're fun because I'm sort of playing with them. I think when I started painting, I felt like the artist controlled everything, you know, and that was probably part of my interest in it, that I could play this little God figure and put these things together. But I think what happened through learning our history and making enough art was that I realized that I had reasons for putting these things together, but sometimes when you put two things together, the implications are so much bigger than my purpose. So I end up getting excited by that. I consciously make work that I want people to interpret. It's there to be made sense of. So I do feel like I'm communicating to an audience that way, but it's not always a story that's like one given meaning.
Well, maybe it's also a bit of your own dialogue with the work, and it
Yeah.
reveals itself to you and
Yeah.
those juxtapositions.
Yeah, and I hope that it does that for a viewer as well, that, you know, what they're bringing to it. Yeah, next. So you saw the ram there, and I was sort of making a reference to Janus and Capricorn. In this scenario, this was another drawing, and another motif that you're going to see through a number of works is these sort of migrating people. But you see this ram, and you see this log in the foreground. Coward, servant, blind man. Those are lyrics from Metallica. It was when I was in high school. Early Metallica was like, I listened to a lot. Disposable Heroes is the song. But I like the implications of that. Coward, servant, blind man. The ram itself next to that log made me think of, next slide, the story of Abraham who sacrifices his son Isaac. You see the competition panels for the gates of the baptistry in Florence, Ghiberti and Brunelleschi. So Abraham's sacrificing his son Isaac, but he's saved by an angel at the last minute, and there's a ram that is caught in brambles that he sacrifices in his place. You know, the next one. So it's through the context of using that ram and having that log there that sort of brought that sort of interpretation up to it. So just like with the tower, is it a derrick? Is it a watchtower? Is it an institution rising or falling? This sort of fascination with the object for me, and then playing it out in some sort of a narrative, is exploring those possibilities. Next. Orange was the sky. With this one, this was a tree that was on the line between my property and my neighbor's, and I was fascinated by the look of it, the strangeness, the way that it sort of went through the air. And on a snowy night, I went out and was fascinated by its form. In the context of what I did with the picture, I was looking at the tree and thinking how long this had been here. I have a historic house, 1766. It's very old, and some of the trees are very old around it. And I think about the history that those trees have seen. And in this scenario, you have a group of people sort of occupied with their own lives, occupied with their own passage, looking down, not really paying attention to the tree. In the tree, you have these ornaments that are from different time periods and different cultures. These are histories that the tree has been a part of, has seen. But the people are not really looking to that history. You know, we're consumed with our own lives. So I think that's sort of what I'm thinking about that. Also, the way that seasons, the tree is in the winter of its life. So when you look at the people, you'll see some people in shorts. You know, they wouldn't be walking in the snow, but they're in a different season of their life. Some are in the spring and in the summer, whereas the tree is in its winter. Next. Sharp was the blade. This was done about the same time. You could tell by the title, it's sort of like a, I don't know, poetry story that pushing it in that direction. the hand sharpening the axe and holding the vise, and you see like the sort of lumberjack outfit. I was interested in telling a narrative, a story, and only giving part of the information, but giving like a strong sort of nudge to interpret it. You know something good is not going to happen. But the inspiration came from like 1940s ads and 50s, like when they showed products, they just like stick it out there like that. You can go to the next slide. So you're seeing like this thing, and you would just have like someone holding this prop. But what was fascinating to me was, you know, there's a person there, but you don't really see them. And so in the piece, I was sort of playing with that a little bit more, and what are the implications of when you're given some information but not enough. I have a friend that's a filmmaker. He loves horror films, and I've seen so many horror films because I'm friends with him. And they always ruin the horror films when they actually show the creature, but before they show the creature, when you hear the creak of the door, that sort of thing, it's so much more frightening. So I was interested in playing with the narrative in that way. You can go back to the next slide. So by not having the character in there, not showing a face, we're so used to reading faces that it did something for me, and I started to experiment more with that. You can go to the next slide. I ended up doing another piece that was part of a different series, but it was sort of similar. Both have these sort of strong areas of a very saturated primary color, blue and red. This is a female on the right. She's holding a can of kerosene. The title comes from a Frank Black song, Frank Black from the Pixies. You know something bad's going to happen there, but you don't know the context. Why does she want to burn this place down? The place already looks ruined, those sort of implications. But I loved not showing all of the figure. You know, you're trained to paint the figure, you're trained to show everything, but sometimes showing less ends up doing something more for it. So I sort of ran with that of not showing so much of the figure. Next slide. And there was a whole series, and this is more recent work, of these abandoned factories. And this is another one where I didn't show the face of the figure, and I thought it worked better. The title Orpheus came from the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. His wife is taken down to the underworld, and he goes to retrieve her, and he can bring her back if he walks back out to the upper world without looking back. He makes it to the upper world, but he turns around, but his wife hasn't made it yet, and so she dissolves as he's turning back. So there's this like strong sense of loss. And there's something about these factories that they were a part of this industry in Connecticut, not just Connecticut, throughout the United States. You see these factories that were these thriving sort of businesses that are just these sort of a wilderness of absence. And so she's leaving this space. You see her, and there's sort of a warm light hitting her, and she's looking back at this space, and you know that this isn't going to come back. So that's sort of why the title came up. Sort of showing depictions of the myth. Next. This is work within that series of working with these factories. I go into these factories and explore different ones, and I create these narratives around them. Next. This is the last piece I'm going to talk about, and it's exactly right behind that screen. It's called Just a Story, but one day someone may say the same of you. I forget which novel I read this in, but I was sort of fascinated with that. And you could tell that I love stories, and that's the thing. When we look at art, when we look at past civilizations, we're retelling the stories of these things. We will be gone, and all that's going to be left are the stories that are told about us. So when I did this piece, I was thinking about, as I would say almost always am, the human journey. What are we doing in life? What are we thinking about as we go through? So I was trying to create this sort of scenario through this drawing, this diptych of drawing. The band of heads I was thinking of, like a Greek chorus. If you look at a Greek play, they're sort of this all-knowing body that sees what goes on, and sometimes they personify what one of the characters wants to say but can't. So I sort of saw them as these sort of witnesses. And the sources are from people that I know, and images found in books. Next slide.